The Covenant and the Cut, on Labor, Belonging, and the Quiet Violence of Modern Work. Elias Winter. May 12, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Opening before the beginning. There are words we do not say anymore. Covenant, vocation, dignity. They sound old, heavy, unfit for quarterly earnings. But once, they named something sacred. Work was not just what we did. It was how we belonged, to each other, to place, to time, to the world. Before the algorithm, before the inbox, before the polite termination call, there was labor, and there was meaning. Not perfect or fair, but rooted. This is a reckoning, not a romance. A story not of golden ages, but of forgotten altars. Because we did not simply lose jobs, we lost memory. And in the silence that followed, we told ourselves it was freedom. This essay is for those who remember otherwise, for those who ache without knowing why, and for those who still believe the soul deserves more than severance. Section 1. The World Before Exit. On Bondage, Belonging, and the Invention of Disposability. There was a time when no one was fired. Not because the world was kind, but because the body was never yours to release. Before the word layoff, before human resources, before the algorithm decided your value at dawn, there was only the labor of survival, bound not to contract, but to caste. You worked because your ancestors had, because the land demanded it, because your master required it, not for fulfillment, not for growth, but because not working meant exile, or famine, or death. In Mesopotamia, in the Nile's slow churn, in the sacred terror of the Aztec sun, labor was not employment, it was identity. To lose your role was not a career shift, it was a collapse of meaning. There were no pink slips in Babylon, no terminations in Tenochtitlan. There were punishments, there were sales, there was silence. And so we must ask, what does it mean that today we call labor flexible? What does it mean that exit is no longer exile, but expectation? The modern mind treats job loss as friction, as churn. But in the pre-modern world, to stop working was to become unmoored from the divine. The guilds of Islamic Persia, the artisans of medieval France, the samurai of feudal Japan, they did not negotiate severance. They bore shame. They lost place. To be expelled from your role was not a market event. It was a moral one. Even slaves had function. Even peasants had lineage. But the gig worker? The contract temp? The substitute teacher with no health care? They vanish without record, without ritual. It is the new invisibility, the updated disposability. We call this freedom. But freedom without covenant is just drift. And labor without belonging is not liberation. It is vapor. So let us name what we've done. We have replaced the bondage of caste with the randomness of markets. We have traded spiritual imprisonment for algorithmic irrelevance, and we are lonelier for it. Because at least in feudal Japan, the rice farmer belonged somewhere. At least in Egypt, the scribe had a god. Today, the worker has a badge, a password, a Slack channel. And when the budget tightens, they have a silence that feels like shame. This is not progress. It is evolution without memory. It is the atomization of the useful. It is the new exile. Section 2. The Factory and the Fire. On the Invention of Disposability and the Soul as Variable Cost. The soot came first, then the time cards, then the clock, and with them the new gospel. Not of grace, not of kinship, but of efficiency. The Industrial Revolution did not merely transform production. It redefined the human being as an input. Before this, labor was sacred, not because it was just, but because it was embedded in land, in caste, in the eye of God. But in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Pittsburgh and Ghent, the soul was remeasured, hour by hour, unit by unit, stripped of memory and baptized in steam. The worker became a lever, a cost, a variable to be trimmed. This was the birth of the layoff, not as punishment, but as logic. No longer was the body expelled for moral failure. Now it was dismissed for inefficiency. No longer was the peasant bound to the land. Now he was bound to the factory, and severed the moment the market dipped. We called this freedom, yet it was freedom like the plank is freedom to the prisoner. You may walk forward, you may fall, and the sea does not remember your name. Factories replaced temples, foremen replaced elders, and the worker, once a member of a covenant, became a cost center in a ledger he would never see. Entire towns starved on the whims of prices set continents away. The loom broke, and so did the family. The boss cut labor by 20%, and the children died. This is not metaphor. This is the archive. And so the spirit cracked. Not because humans cannot endure suffering, but because suffering without purpose is a poison. Into that poison came resistance, not first as theory, but as cry. The Luddites were not fools. They were witnesses. They saw that the machine did not merely produce, it replaced. It did not merely spin cloth, it discarded flesh. And Marx, for all his fire, named the system's secret engine, a reserve army of labor, the always unemployed, the almost starving, whose desperation disciplines the rest. Layoffs are not capitalism's failure, they are its design. And yet, even here, something sacred stirred. For the first time, the cast-offs saw each other, not as competitors, as kin. They named themselves not just poor, but workers, a class, a force, a memory. Because even disposability, when shared, can become meaning. Section 3. The year the world was fired. On collapse without blame and the shame that remained. It was not a war. It was not a plague. It was a silence. New York, 1932. The towers still stood. The suits still walked. But the work was gone. Not because you sinned, because the machine choked on its own smoke. Factories emptied like lungs after a scream. Banks locked. Farms died. Markets vanished. And no one explained. You were not laid off because you failed. You were laid off because the spell broke, and the spell had no soul. This was not a recession. This was spiritual famine disguised as economics. A man who had worn a tie now held a sign. Will work for food. A father who once fed others now watched his children shrink. A woman who cleaned offices now sat in line, cold, with no shoes. And yet, there was no enemy to strike, no face to blame, only systems, algorithms of abandonment, equations of ruin. This is the violence of structure. When the cruelty is impersonal, the shame becomes internal. That is the secret of the Great Depression. It turned mass failure into personal guilt. And still, the body stood. Out of this devastation rose not vengeance, but a question. Does a nation owe you labor, or only liberty to beg? Roosevelt answered with scaffolding, not salvation. Public works, social insurance, and imperfect grace. For the first time, the state confessed. If too many are cast out, the market dies. If the worker falls, democracy follows. But not every answer was mercy. In Germany, shame became fascism. In America, it became the New Deal. One chose violence, one chose repair, and yet both emerged from the same wound, the terror of being discarded. Because when the world fires you, and the gods say nothing, the soul begins to doubt its place in the order of things. Layoffs were no longer private. They became ritual, mass excommunications by a system that forgot its own priests. And still we blamed the poor. Still we asked the man with the sign if he'd tried harder. Still we taught the next generation to hustle, as if the flood could be outrun by grit. But some of us remember. Not the numbers, the silence, not the collapse, the shame. And we carry it still. Section 4. The Golden Cage. On loyalty, illusion, and the work that promised to stay. There was a time they said it would last forever. The war had ended. The factories roared. The suburbs bloomed like managed dreams. A man in a tie, a woman in heels, a lunchbox, a pension, a promise. You worked, you stayed, and the job stayed with you. This was the great mid-century myth, that if you obeyed, if you gave the best hours of your life to the company, it would protect you, like a father, like a flag. And for a time, it did. Fordism, unionism, seniority, the holy trinity of post-war labor. In Japan, lifetime employment became the covenant. In France, workers had holidays codified in law. In America, the assembly line became altar, and GM the priest. But the promise was not universal. It was built on exclusions. The boom was not for the black body, not for the migrant, not for the woman whose resume bore a child's name instead of a college. It was a promise built on hierarchy. Yet it was still a promise. And for the men who received it, it felt like grace. That's what makes this moment sacred. Not because it was just, but because it believed it could be. This was the brief flicker in which labor became identity without terror. To work was to matter. To matter was to endure. But every Eden has a serpent, and this one wore a suit. Behind the stable paycheck was the need for growth, and behind growth, war, extraction, domination. This covenant was funded by empire, by post-colonial theft, by oil that wasn't ours, by supply chains that hid the scream. And when the numbers tightened, the covenant cracked. Reagan spoke of freedom, Thatcher of discipline. But what they meant was this: you are on your own now. The pink slips returned, the pensions vanished, and the gods of productivity no longer answered prayers. But for one fleeting generation, between the ashes of one war and the illusions of the next, a lie became a lullaby. That work, if done loyally, would never let you go. We now know it was myth, but even myths can leave a scar. And some still carry the shame of a promise that was never real, but still felt like home. Section 5. The Gospel of Flexibility. On freedom that fractures and the religion of the self-employed. They called it liberation. No more factory clocks, no more union dues, no more boss at your shoulder. Just you, your laptop, your hustle, your brand. They called it the future of work. Yet it was the dismemberment of covenant. This was the neoliberal reformation, not of theology, but of labor. A new gospel, sung in spreadsheets and TED Talks. Flexibility is freedom. Contracts are dead. You are the product. It sounded like emancipation, yet it was atomization with better lighting. Corporations shed workers like skins. Full-time became part-time. Part-time became freelance. Freelance became gig. And the body, once protected by law, by solidarity, by shame, became a username in someone else's database. You were no longer fired. You were off-boarded. Not with rage, not with closure, with silence, with an app notification. And still, we smiled. We called ourselves founders, creators, nomads. We drank from the language of disruption without asking who bled for the breakthrough. But deep down, we knew this was not empowerment. It was prettied-up precarity. Because beneath the freedom to work from anywhere was the truth that nowhere would keep you. You were flexible because no one had to hold you. You were agile because permanence was over. And so we traded the factory for the feed, the union for the personal brand, the pension for the hope of virality. It worked for some, but for most, it meant no health care, no floor, no map, and no one to call when the job disappears. This is what they never said. Flexibility is not freedom if you are the only one bending. And the self-employed soul, stripped of ritual, of co-workers, of place, becomes not a visionary, but a priest without a parish, an altar with no worshippers, a brand in search of a god. Section 6. The Great Unveiling. On the collapse that spoke clearly, and the labor that remembered its name. It began with breath, or rather, the lack of it. A virus, invisible and indifferent, swept across borders and bodies, and the world paused, not in reflection, but in rupture. Airports went silent, offices emptied, and suddenly, the myth collapsed. Essential. That was the word they chose. For the nurse, the janitor, the grocery clerk, the delivery driver, the ones we used but never named. In a matter of weeks, the hierarchy of labor inverted, and the ones who could zoom away were revealed to be non-essential, disposable in khakis, while the ones we discarded became the pillars of continuity. And for a brief moment, the veil lifted. The economist stuttered. The CEO tweeted condolences, and even the billionaires played somber piano from their bunkers. But it didn't last. We didn't raise their wages. We called them heroes and sent them back into the fire. We didn't offer protection. We offered applause, because it was never about justice. It was about optics. This is the cruelty of the pandemic. It revealed the truth and then reinstated the lie. We saw who keeps the world alive, and then we put them back in the shadows. But something had already shifted. Because for the first time in a generation, the worker remembered, I am not a cost, I am a covenant. And they walked. In record numbers, they left. Nurses, teachers, baristas, coders, not in rage, but in realization that no job, no brand, no health plan tethered to employment is worth the quiet death of dignity. And this, too, was a kind of strike. Not with signs, but with absence. The Great Resignation was not a tantrum. It was a testimony. It said, if the world can pause, so can I. If the contract is broken, I will not keep pretending. If you call me essential, then treat me like I matter. But we didn't. We reopened. We forgot. And now the layoffs return, dressed as efficiency, the cost-cutting, the restructuring, the pivot. We name them with euphemism. But the worker knows now, they will discard you and call it reinvention. They will clap for you and still let you die. But you are not disposable. And the pause, though brief, has already written something new into the bones of labor. The silence remembered its name, and it will not be forgotten. Section 7. The mind that replaced the hand. On the coming silence, the ghost in the code, and the last human task. They say the future has arrived, but it does not knock. It whispers, through autocomplete, through image generation, through machines that mimic thought, faster, cleaner, tireless. And so we enter the next great decoupling, not of labor and land, not of job and permanence, but of effort and intellect. AI does not threaten the factory alone. It threatens the mind itself, the accountant, the analyst, the writer. The very roles once lifted from the dirt by education are now cued for automation. And the story repeats. First, they tell us it will help. Then they say we must adapt. Then they ask us to leave. But this time, there is no field to return to, no factory, no fallback. Just a digital ether, infinite and indifferent, that learns by swallowing us whole. We feed it our voices, our queries, our memories, and then we ask it to replace us. We have made a God in the image of our knowledge, and now we pray to it for relevance. But here is the truth. No machine dreams of meaning. No algorithm fears obsolescence. Only we do. Because meaning is not in the output. It is in the ache. The work we do, when it matters, is not just economic. It is liturgical. It roots us, binds us, reflects us. And when it is gone, the soul unravels. That is the real risk of automation. Not unemployment. Unbelonging. We will still survive, but we will not be necessary. And in that word, unnecessary, is a grief no severance can salve. So what remains? What cannot be replaced? Only that which requires presence. The hospice nurse who whispers the last word. The teacher who sees a child no test can quantify. The hand that buries the dead and holds the living. And the writer who names what the machine cannot feel. We are entering an age in which usefulness will be measured by code. But usefulness was never the point. Dignity is, and no machine can teach it. So let the AI write the memo. Let it balance the ledger. But let the human tell the truth, that we are not made for efficiency alone. We are made for witness, and until we forget that, we are not obsolete. Section 8. The Ritual of the Cut. On the age of quiet discarding and the future. We still dare to shape. They don't even look you in the eye anymore. Just a Zoom link, a calendar block. Hey, can we chat for 5 minutes? Then it comes, the script, the silence, the severance. No sin, no scandal, just a decision. Somewhere, a line in a spreadsheet moved, and you vanished. This is the new priesthood of power, hands that never touch what they destroy. And the layoff? It has become sacrament, a quarterly ritual, bloodless, rehearsed, offered not to fix a wound, but to please a God named shareholder confidence. You weren't bad, you weren't slow, you were simply excess. And they will say it gently. They will tell you the company is restructuring, that the macro environment has shifted, that your contributions were deeply valued, just not enough to protect. But what they won't say is this: you were useful, until you weren't. And now, your usefulness offends the margin. This is not collapse in fire. This is collapse by calendar. And yet, the deeper truth is not in the cruelty. It's in what we choose next. Because this moment of unraveling, is also a reckoning. A moment to ask, what is work for? Who does it serve? And what do we owe to the ones we discard? For decades, we bowed to the logic of flexibility, the religion of growth. We called it modernity. We called it merit. Yet it was only delay, structured postponement of the obvious truth, that an economy without loyalty cannot build a society with soul. So, what now? We could double down. Faster cuts, smarter AI, cleaner exits, more polite ways to say you are no longer needed. Or dash. We could remember. That work was never meant to be extraction. It was meant to be covenant. That a layoff is not just a business decision. It is a communal wound. that every chart hides a name, and every name hides a story. And if we remembered that, really remembered, then perhaps we would build something different. Not just an economy that pays, a world that holds. Because the future is not yet written in code, and grace has not yet been priced out. Epilogue: the work that remains. We live in the aftermath of a forgetting, where meaning is outsourced, belonging is branded, and the worker is once again unseen. But forgetting is not erasure. The silence remembers. Every layoff is a liturgy, every resignation a lament. And somewhere beneath the churn and the code and the calendar blocks, the sacred still stirs. Not in metrics, not in strategy, but in the quiet, unyielding truth that we were not made to be optimized. We were made to hold one another. And so the question is not whether the system sees us, it is whether we will see each other again. Not as inputs. And perhaps, this time, we begin small, with one act of witness, one refusal to forget, a handwritten note instead of a cold offboarding, a workplace ritual that marks exits with gratitude, a table where the discarded are still invited. Because covenant is not scale. It is attention, and in attention there is repair, not as costs, but as covenants, still unbroken. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.